So you've been digging into some really interesting ideas about gender.
Yeah.
And we're here today to unpack the key stuff from Beyond Binary, Gender's Global Tapestry. Basically give you the highlights, maybe spark some new thoughts.
Exactly. And the fact that you've engaged with this book, it really points to something important, doesn't it? That gender is, well, way more complex than just male or female.
Oh, absolutely. And what's so great about the material you send over is just the sheer scope of it. We're going to look at, pre-colonial gender fluidity, then how colonialism kind of shifted things.
Right, the impact there.
Then jump to modern revivals, tech stuff, even the backlash.
Which is definitely happening.
Yeah, and then policy and, what the future might look like. The idea is to really get a handle on how different cultures, historically and now, understand gender beyond that strict binary. So where does this whole story start?
Well, a really lovely starting point is Leela Krishnan's Mohiniyattam dance class in Kerala, India. So, this dance, traditionally, it was women only. But now, it's open to everyone, all genders.
Oh.
And what's really interesting is the connection to the myth of Vishnu taking a female form, Mohini, to restore cosmic balance. The story itself kind of hints at fluidity.
It really does, doesn't it? And
Yeah.
you mentioned someone like Arjun, an engineering student, taking the class alongside all sorts of ages. That feels significant.
It is. It shows these expressions aren't just like locked into old expectations. And you also mentioned Kerala's history of matrilineal clans.
Right. How does that fit in?
Well, that's super important context. In matrilineal systems, lineage, inheritance, it all goes through the mother's side.
Okay.
So women often held considerable social, maybe economic power, and that could definitely influence how gender roles worked, maybe allowing for more, variety beyond just male-female.
Interesting. So it really pushes back on the idea that patriarchy was like the universal default.
Exactly.
Where else does the book take us in that pre-colonial world?
Okay, so then we jump over to the Dahomey Kingdom, which is modern-day Benin.
All right.
And we meet the Mino. They were this all-female military unit, sometimes called King's Wives.
Ah, I think I've heard of them, the Amazons.
Sort of, yeah, though Mino's more accurate. But here's the thing.
Yeah.
They weren't just soldiers. They were deeply involved in governing trade, advising kings, diplomacy, not just fighting.
So real political power, too.
Absolutely. And they were celibate, which also messes with typical gendered ideas about family and marriage.
Yeah, that's a key detail. So they weren't just filling a male role. They had this distinct, powerful position. It really challenges those narrow boxes for women.
Precisely. And then if we look at the Musuo people in China, another fascinating example, matrilineal again.
Okay, how did that work?
Well, women controlled property, rituals. Men mainly contributed labor, but within their sisters' households.
Huh.
And the book emphasizes this wasn't necessarily about women dominating men. It was seen as more of a pragmatic way to divide labor based on their kinship system.
It sounds like these societies were just organizing themselves differently, based on contributions, maybe not rigidly tied to sex assigned at birth.
That seems to be a key takeaway. And, the book brings in the biology, too, and Fausto Sterling's research.
Oh, right, the intersex traits.
Yeah, occurring in about 1.7% of births. It kind of shows that even biological sex isn't always a neat binary.
That's a really important point. Nature itself has variations. And then the cultural examples like the Mahu in indigenous Hawaiian culture.
Yes, Mahu revered as a third gender, seen as embodying both masculine and feminine energies, often healers, teachers, really respected roles.
And what about the Igbo people in Nigeria, the Ogbanje children?
Right, Ogbanje. Believed to have this spiritual duality connected to both human and divine worlds. They weren't seen as flawed, but actually celebrated as like bridges between realms.
Wow. So when you pull all these different threads together,
Yeah.
what's the big picture of pre-colonial gender?
I think the strong suggestion is that for many societies, gender wasn't this fixed two-option thing. It was more like a flexible spectrum, a tool almost for social harmony, for different functions.
That feels so different from what came next with colonialism, which the book really lays bare.
Oh, definitely.
You see it with the British missionaries in Kerala just dismissing matrilineal ways, Spanish colonizers in the Americas pushing patriarchy, Jesuit priests in the Philippines calling the Babylon, who were often female or gender-fluid shamans, witch doctors.
Exactly.
Oh.
Colonialism acted like, well, the book calls it a scalpel, systematically cutting away these nuanced traditions.
Yeah.
And imposing the male-female binary wasn't just, a cultural preference. It was often tied directly to economic control, political power.
You can really see how those colonial audits, as you put it, set up new power structures, especially around land, labor. Making things binary made them easier to control, maybe.
Absolutely. Which leads us right into that next chapter. Colonialism's scalpel how binaries became bureaucracy. It wasn't just about ideas, it was about writing this binary into law, into the system.
Like the Spanish lays, the Indias in the 16th century Americas, mandating European-style nuclear families.
Right.
Totally disrupting indigenous kinship, stripping women of their roles with land and property.
Yeah, the impact on Nahua and Quechua societies, dismantling their kinship structures.
Yeah.
It was devastating. Lasting effects on women's autonomy, their power.
And then over in Bengal, the British East India Company's 1793 Permanent Settlement Act. What did that do?
So that basically handed land ownership over to male zamindars.
Okay.
And in doing so, it just wiped out existing matrilineal systems, like among Adivasi groups where women had traditionally managed forest. It was about money, fundamentally. Monetizing land, concentrating wealth with men.
So these weren't just like social suggestions. They were hard economic shifts, deciding who gets what based purely on these imposed gender lines.
Totally. And then you have the whole Victorian England separate spheres idea floating around.
Ah, yes. Men as breadwinners, women in the home.
Exactly. And that idea got exported everywhere through colonial schools.
That Cambridge study you mentioned, linking British colonial rule to modern gender wage gaps, that really hits home.
It does. An example of the missionary schools in Kenya, teaching girls sewing and boys carpentry.
Yeah.
It shows how actively that division was drilled in, creating this labor divide that, well, lasted.
It's pretty clear how these roles tied to economics just got baked into the system over generations, even something as horrific as slavery in the U.S. South. This book mentions reducing gender to just field hands or breeders.
A brutal taxonomy of labor, basically.
Yeah.
Weaponizing gender itself.
Yeah, and bringing it to today, that World Bank figure, $160 trillion lost globally in lifetime earnings because of gender inequality. It's just staggering, the economic cost of these old biases.
It really is.
Yeah.
But thankfully, the story doesn't stop there. The book moves into grassroots revival stitching old wisdom into new fabrics. And there are some really hopeful stories there.
I was really drawn to the bit about Sweden's rainbow preschools, using gender-neutral heroes like Pippi Longstocking, the pronoun hen. That feels so intentional.
It absolutely is. It's about creating space for kids outside those immediate gender boxes.
Right.
And that Uppsala University study, linking it to a 40% drop in adolescent anxiety.
That's huge.
It really is. And the educator, Lena Bergstrom, talking about how it helps kids learn collaborative conflict resolution when they're not stuck in gender stereotypes. That's powerful too.
Definitely. And then shifting gears, the Jagori Collective in Rajasthan, India, reviving old ways of managing water.
Yes. This is such a great example of how traditional ecological knowledge often involve flexible gender roles.
Right.
That quote from Radha Patel ancestors, debating monsoons, not arguing about men's work, says it all. And the results are tangible. Fewer water conflicts, women stepping into leadership on irrigation councils, men championing soil conservation. It's working in hundreds of villages.
It really shows how looking back can actually provide very practical, modern solutions, and that gender roles can adapt based on, what's needed, who has the knowledge.
Exactly. And look at the Aymara in Bolivia, reviving Chachawarmi, this idea of gender as complementary energies.
How are they applying that now?
They're using it in actual municipal councils, pairing male and female leaders for co-governance. It's this blend of tradition and modern policy.
That quote from Mayor Carlos Mamani about balance, not just equality, that's a subtle but important distinction.
It is. And the fact that they're seeing a 30% drop in domestic violence in those areas, it suggests this approach has real, deep social benefits.
Which then leads into technology, right? Chapter 4, technology as a bridge. How does tech fit into this?
It's fascinating. There's this Kenyan-developed app, Harmony. It uses machine learning to analyze how couples communicate, but without gender labels.
Okay, so what does it look for?
Things like solution-seeking patterns or emotion acknowledging. Focuses on the type of communication, not who is doing it based on gender.
Huh.
And apparently lots of users in Brazil and Japan are reporting like a much deeper understanding of their partners. That story from Sao Paulo, reframing nagging as just problem solving.
That's so telling, isn't it? How quickly we slap on those gendered labels.
Exactly. And then you've got caregiver robots in Japan from TMS UK.
Robots. How do they avoid gender bias?
Well, they're designed to adapt their communication to the patient. They learn what works for that specific individual bypassing assumptions about, say, how a man or woman might want to be spoken to.
Interesting.
The CEO, Yuki Tanaka, basically says the robots learn what's effective, regardless of gendered voice tones or anything. And patient engagement is up, especially among men.
Wow, okay. And the last tech example was South Korea's AI mediator project.
Right. Using natural language processing in workplaces. It flags potentially gendered or biased phrases in communications about disputes.
And suggests alternatives.
Exactly. Suggests neutral ways to phrase things. Big companies like Samsung and Hyundai are trying it out, and apparently they've seen about a 25% drop in gender-related HR complaints.
Using tech to nudge communication towards neutrality. That's clever.
It is. But of course, these kinds of shifts don't happen without pushback. Which brings us to Chapter 5. Backlash. The fear of losing hierarchy.
Right. This is crucial to understand, too.
Yeah, challenging these long-held binaries, it definitely makes some people uncomfortable. It can feel like a threat to existing power structures, to the way things are. Look at Hungary's 2018 ban on gender studies.
Calling it foreign propaganda.
Right. But the book cleverly contrasts that with historical facts, like records of Hungarian women settling land disputes way back in medieval times, or those 10th century graves showing female warriors.
So the tradition they're claiming to protect might not even be accurate?
Precisely. That archaeologist, Esther Mellis, her findings directly challenge that simple binary past. And the book links the backlash partly to anxiety, maybe about EU labor reforms potentially shaking up patriarchal control.
That makes sense. And then Ghana's 2023 Family Values Bill, criminalizing non-traditional gender advocacy.
Yeah, and again, it seems to ignore their own history. Figures like Queen Mother Yaa Asantewaa in the Ashanti Empire, a major political and military leader.
Led a war, didn't she?
She did. The War of the Golden Stool in 1900. But now, activists citing her are called Western puppets. It shows that fear, as historian Kwame Osei puts it, the fear of losing the power to define what's traditional.
And the book ties this backlash to economic anxiety, too.
There's an IMF report mentioned saying rigid gender roles actually make it harder for societies to adapt to things like automation.
That's an interesting angle.
Yeah, and look at Saudi Arabia. More women are working, which is boosting the GDP significantly.
Billions, right?
Yeah, like $90 billion.
Yeah.
But you still hear warnings from some conservative clerics about social decay. It really highlights that tension between economic reality and entrenched social views.
So policy becomes really important here. Chapter 6, policy as a catalyst rewriting the rules. What are some positive examples?
Well, Spain's 2023 Caregiving Equality Act is a big one, mandating equal paternity and maternity leave.
Trying to make caregiving a truly shared thing.
Exactly. And the early numbers show more dads taking leave, and that anecdote from the father in Barcelona, Javier Molina, about how it changes perceptions, that's the real-world impact.
Yeah, and Rwanda's constitution after the genocide, reserving parliamentary seats for women.
A really powerful example. Over 60% of seats reserved for women. And look what happened. Major healthcare reforms, maternal mortality dropped massively.
60% drop, wasn't it?
Huge. And MP Immaculée Ingabire talks about how having women in power just fundamentally redefined priorities.
Yeah.
Plus, they brought in male literacy programs too, connecting it to reducing domestic violence. It's holistic.
That's really impressive. And Canada's Indigenous Languages Revitalization Fund. How does language fit in?
This is fascinating. Supporting the reintegration of terms like Otiniya. It's a free word meaning something like balanced leadership.
Balanced leadership.
Yeah, reflecting older governance models where gender roles were complementary, serving community needs. Elder Marie Linklater's quote about language shaping our world. Bringing back words like Otiniya is about bringing back that worldview.
Language as a tool for change. Okay, so finally, Chapter 7, The Future, a Symphony of Voices. Where are things heading?
It feels hopeful, focusing on younger generations and new tools. You see stats like a third of young Indonesians rejecting strict gender roles.
Yeah.
And Nigerian teens on social media mixing Yoruba proverbs with modern ideas about equality, using hashtags like #GenderOsContext. They're actively creating new dialogues, often drawing on forgotten parts of their own history.
That's really cool, blending old and new.
Exactly. And then you have schools in New Zealand using Maori concepts like Wakawangatanga relationship building for conflict resolution, focusing on the collective, not individual labels.
Moving beyond labels.
And tech, again, like Silicon Valley startups, ungendered labs, designing AI to audit corporate language for hidden bias.
Auditing job descriptions and things.
Yeah, working with big players like Microsoft, UNICEF, rewriting thousands of job descriptions. The CEO, Ria Mehta, talks about reinventing language itself. It's ambitious.
It really is. So, Wrapping up this deep dive, what's the core takeaway from all this material you shared?
I think it boils down to this, that old Mars versus Venus male-female binary. It's just a massive oversimplification. Reality is so much richer, so much more varied.
Totally agree. And the book gives us those great images, doesn't it? The Oaxaca drum circles, the Rajasthan water councils, places where gender thrives through exchange, through working together.
Exactly. And thinking back to the very beginning, to Arjun dancing Mohiniyattam,
Yeah.
it's not really about him crossing some forbidden line.
Yeah.
It's more about showing that the line itself isn't as solid or maybe even as necessary as we've been led to believe.
That leaves us and you with a really interesting question to chew on, doesn't it? What actually becomes possible for us as individuals, for society, if we stop being maybe a little bit afraid of the gender spectrum, start actually engaging with all its diversity? Think about those examples, ancient and modern, and how they might just reshape your own understanding of gender and its place in the world.